All right, welcome back, friends. So let's get going. Today, we get to look at utilitarianism as a moral theory and a normative claim. So, the principle of utility essentially states that the morally right action produces the greatest happiness to the greatest number. What is happiness? Well, we just talked about this. Of any given set of choices, that option that most maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain to those parties affected by the choice. Nope. This line here says nope. Hide this. Yes, please. So, watch Mr. A struggle. It's precious. Can I move this? No, I can't. So, nothing is inherently forbidden. This is one of the really cool benefits of utilitarianism. Remember, this is claiming to be an objective, universal moral theory, that this applies to everyone everywhere, whether you're in the North Hemisphere, the Southern Hemisphere, on a plane, on a boat, Sunday, right? Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 1,000 years ago, in 1,000 years. The morally correct action is the one that produces the greatest happiness to the greatest number. So if you kind of liked ethical egoism, the idea that what's moral is what's good in result for the individual, but you were like, you know what, I think we need to take into consideration others, this is your moral theory. It says anytime any action affects other people, whatever the correct action is the one that maximizes pleasure over pain to everyone. So let's take, for instance, let's say I come home on a Sunday and all I want to do is watch football. But my kids are like, Dad, take me to the zoo. Take me to the zoo. Do I want to take my kids to the zoo? Heck no, I don't want to take my kids to the zoo. But I do it because, one, I want to be a good father. I want my kids to be happy. Their happiness will go up. Now, me, myself, I want to just watch football, but they're going to suffer and, have to squander. And so in that situation, any given situation, the action that produces the greatest happiness to the greatest number. And this is why when I did the thought experiment with the $5,000, we know that that money goes further for like life-saving things in other countries than it does here, right? Whereas most of us kept most of it, right? Maybe held our friends and family. And this is an interesting, I want to really emphasize this. Utilitarianism says that physical proximity is no indication of your moral requirements, right? That like you owe other people around the world the same that you owe the people next door, right? If your given actions can affect others, right, then you should help them out. And so there are some like legit utilitarians who, above their what it costs to survive, and pay for their basic necessities and maybe a little frivolity, they try to spend their money in a very like what you would consider philanthropic, but it's utilitarian. They're giving their money so that it has the greatest bang for its buck. Does that make sense? Hopefully, maybe not. Now, I think another of the really, like I started on, another of the really interesting benefits of utilitarianism is that it says nothing is inherently forbidden. Now, at the beginning, I said that there are some things I think that make my never okay list, but utilitarianism doesn't say that. It says, really, you judge things based on the outcome, right? How many people are harmed, how many people are helped. And so, like, some things like same-sex marriage, right, which used to be very controversial. It's less so these days. Or interracial marriages used to be very controversial, like 100 years ago. Utilitarianism says, hey, if both people are willing, if it's going to increase their happiness, there's nothing inherently, unless it's like harming people, but if it's consensual, if they're of an age, right? The one hidden here, Mr. Doak can't figure out how to do stuff. Prostitution, sex work, for those of you who aren't familiar, generally forbidden, right? Selling your body for sex, exchanging sexual relations for money. But according to utilitarianism, right, we want to use the theory, make a claim, have a result, conclusion. Utilitarianism says, well, if both parties are willing, if they're not being forced, coerced, threatened, if they give it freely and voluntarily, that's fine, because both parties clearly think that the thing they want is worth what they're giving, right? Now you might say, and then there's a nuanced argument we'll get to when we get to organ sales versus donation on the constraints that are on people in those positions who would sell their body for sex or would give an organ for money. So we will look at that. Euthanasia, we've already briefly touched upon this. We'll touch upon it again a little bit more. But those people who think that the Death with Dignity Act, that some people with terminally ill conditions who know that their life is only going to deteriorate with increased pain and suffering, want to end it, right? And do it in a way that's in their control. Utilitarianism allows that. Same with recreational drug use, like, for instance, marijuana. If you do this cost benefit and the benefits outweigh the dangers of it, right? It's not like alcohol, right? Which is like has a lot of people under its death toll, whereas marijuana just has a lot of people on Netflix and Funyuns, right? I mean, there's some benefit, there's some harms, it sounds like, with increasing paranoia in people who are inclined to that. But I'm just making the case that you can see how utilitarianism offers itself as a way to do like an inner calculus in any given action to decide, nothing's inherently wrong, nothing's inherently good, is all in the outcome and based on the people affected. Make sense? Okay, let's do a little thought experiment and see who you really are. I apologize for not being able to get the little thing away at the bottom, but I'll read it out loud to us. Mr. Delk has his skill sets, but it is not the technological nuance. Call me a Luddite. So, are you ready? I'm going to give you 3 cases and see how your moral inclinations swing. Yeah? Kind of like the trolley car. So, let's say you're in a hot room and you've got a fan blowing on you. And that fan, basically, I mean, you know how that cool air is on a hot day? It accounts to 100 units of happiness. Wouldn't it be nice if we could quantify happiness this accurately, right? Well, there's 100 people in the next room. And my fan, as it blows on me, there's just a slight air that goes into the next room, giving 100 other people 1 unit of happiness. So they get just a faint breeze. They wish they had more, right? You know the feeling. And so this is case 1. I have the fan blowing on me. I get 100 units. I mean, I'm chilling. Like, it's good, right? Next room over, there's 100 people who get 1 unit each. So total units of happiness, 200, right? Greatest good to the greatest number. Choice 2. I have 100 unit. I have the fan blowing on me. I have 100 units of happiness. I turn the fan just a little bit more, right? And everyone in the next room, 100 people, get 2 units of happiness each. Now it's like a moderate breeze, right? So they get 2 units. So how many units total is that? 100 plus 200? 300 units of happiness. So what I want you to choose, and if we did this in class, I would poll people and yada, yada, yada. What's the morally correct choice? Is it choice 1 or choice 2, or are either choice morally acceptable? Does that make sense? So choice 1, choice 2, pause it. Coming back, most of you probably said choice 2 is the morally preferable choice, certainly according to utilitarianism, but maybe just in general, saying that, really, if you get the same amount in case 1, situation 1, and situation 2, but you can give other people that much more, 200 units versus 100 units, then you're morally obligated to, help others, right? That's well and good. Maybe we'll hold that position. Here, this is okay. Choice 2. Case 2, choice 1. Our control. Our control group. I have the fan on me, 100 units. People in the next room, 1 unit each. They get 100 total, 100 plus 100, 200 units of happiness. Situation 2. Now, I literally turn the fan almost halfway into the next room. So I'm getting like 50 units of happiness, half of what I was getting. But the people in the next room get 200 units of happiness, right? And so, greatest good to the greatest number, 50 units from me, 200 units from them. How many units of happiness is that? It's 250, even though you can't see it in the corner there. So again, What's the morally correct choice to make? Is it choice 1, right, to keep it for yourself and give them incidental, right? Or choice 2, to turn it halfway so that you're only getting 50 units, but the sum total of happiness is greater? Or is choice 1 or choice 2 morally acceptable, right? Pause. Let me know what you think. And finally, case 3. Our control situation, 100 units on me, 1 unit on 100 people, 200 tops. Or choice 2. Now I literally not only turn the fan all the way away, but it's basically like an air conditioner, right? And so I turn it so it's just blowing like cold air in the next room and hot air on me. And so I have negative 50 units of happiness. Now that is a euphemism for pain and suffering if I've ever heard one, right? So I'm just getting hot air blown on me. It sucks. But the 100 people in the next room each get 3 units of happiness each. So how much is that in total? 300 from them. So 300 units for them minus my 50 units, because I'm just sweating, right? Still equals what? 250. So how do we vote? Is choice 1 the morally correct choice? Is choice 2 the morally correct choice? Or are either choices morally acceptable? So if you were pushing for the utilitarian argument that you should do you should do what's greatest to the greatest number, do you still go with choice 2? Are you willing to suffer for the greater good? Or, I wish we could talk about this, do you stop short of that? You are willing to give up some of your happiness, right? But you're not willing to suffer, right? To be in pain to help others. Or are you a principled person, right? You think, nope, utilitarianism seems like the best way to go. Even here, I would be willing to suffer if it really was best for the group. Yeah. So hopefully you get a little bit of window into seeing how much of an egoist, right? I really do think what's moral is what's best for me, and how much of a utilitarian. I really do think there needs to be a real balance between what's good for me and what's good for others. And I'm even willing to forego some of what's good for me and maybe even suffer, which is an added layer, right? Hopefully this makes sense. So, moving right along, act utilitarianism for our textbooks. The morally correct action in any given situation is the one that produces the greatest overall utility in its consequences. Now, this is basically what we've been talking about. One of the critiques that a lot of people raise against act utilitarianism is it seems like it justifies the ends justify the means, right? Whereas maybe when I think Michael Sandel talks about this when, the pioneers and the settlers came to America, we moved west and we just pushed the Indians further and further away. And basically, the minority groups got subjugated or obliterated for the greater good, for the majority, right? And there's a read on utilitarianism that says that really the rights of individuals or minorities are justified in being violated, and certain actions are justified as long as it produces the greatest overall good. And as we learn with ethical egoism, even if you agree with the principle, you have to recognize how very difficult it is to figure out what's actually good in the outcome, right? How do you know who's going to be affected in what way? How many times have we planned something out and it didn't go the way we thought it would go, right? So it's very difficult to do something and justify it based on the outcome if the outcome's not there yet, right? Um, and I will offer some prompts coming up here to test this idea of whether act utilitarianism, justifies violating the rights of individuals. So one classic example from the days of my high school years, like Jack Bauer 24 style. So you have a terrorist who has a bomb, he wants to blow up LA or something, right? Big city, 14 million. And the terrorist wants to bomb's hidden, nuclear bomb, gonna kill them all. But the terrorist is a family man. So there's like a wife and kids, right? And you know where they live. And if you go and kill the wife or child, you know that the terrorist will turn himself in to save the rest of his family, right? Hypothetical. What's the right thing to do? Well, act utilitarianism, would say it's just like the trolley car. As sad as it is to kill one or two innocent people, if you can save 5 or 14 million, right? It's just a numbers game. As sad as it is, we're not saying that the lost life isn't valuable, but which is a greater travesty? A lot of people have trouble with this because does seem like it fails to account for wrongs, right? I want you to look for a theory that gives an adequate definition and explanation for why certain things are right or wrong. Yeah. Rule utilitarianism attempts to be an explanation and an answer, a solution to sort of this basic critique of act utilitarianism. And it says, okay, the morally correct action in any given situation is the one that follows a general moral rule that produces the greatest overall utility and its consequences. So what the heck is this saying? Let's take the terrorist and, his family. Act utilitarianism may say, all right, yep, as bad as it is, go and kill one of the family to get him to turn himself in, stop the bomb, et cetera, et cetera. But rule utilitarianism says, okay, the morally correct action is the action that, if made into a general rule people followed, would produce the greatest overall utility and its consequence. This is weird. This is going to take a little bit of thinking to make it make sense. Excuse me. So, how would rule utilitarians treat the terrorist and the bomb? Would a rule utilitarian say, go ahead and kill the wife or the child? Or would they not? Right? What action, if made into a general rule, anytime there was a great threat to citizens, and you had to sacrifice innocent life to avert this great, would that result in the greatest good to the greatest number? Right? This is tough. I wish we had class to discuss it. Most people come down on both sides. They say, yes, it does justify killing the person. No, it doesn't justify it, because what would happen is maybe a loss of faith in law enforcement. Citizens would stop trusting law enforcement if they knew that they would just kill innocent people if they had a good enough reason, right? Well, this is hypothetical, right? And kind of a trash example, like a lot of the examples offered in ethics books, sadly, but we pick and choose. So a couple years ago, I tried to come up with a more realistic example. And boy, how poignant it is. Some of you may have seen this, some of you may have not, but there are lots of videos over my lifetime of cops framing people that they arrest. They plant drugs on them or weapons. Usually it's drugs. And the idea is, a lot of times cops know that, say, a drug dealer is a drug dealer, but they can't catch them, right? They, in small towns, who's who, and sometimes they're peddling drugs to underagers, right? Are the cops justified in fraudulently arresting someone on minor charges, knowing they're getting who's really a dangerous person off the street, right? Well, in an individual situation, you might think, sure, if the cops really do know this is a really bad guy, maybe they would be justified in pulling him over and saying he was speeding or crossing the center line when he really wasn't, because they know who he is and they want to just, get him off the streets to. Well, act utilitarianism might say, they're breaking the law, but they're actually producing the greatest good to the greatest number, because this really is a dangerous person in the neighborhood, right? You see the parallels to the terrorists and the bomb, kind of? They're doing the wrong thing for a good result. Yeah, that's the thinking. Well, what would rule utilitarianism say about cops framing a criminal or a drug dealer? Well, I don't want to be too blunt, but look at America right now. I mean, our faith and trust in policing nationwide, I would say, is at a pretty all-time low, at least my lifetime, right? That citizens just don't trust cops because there have been enough videos of cops framing somebody, right? Planting evidence, covering up for the aggression, the increased aggression on other cops. And as a result, it has resulted in a net loss, to America, right? The greatest good to the greatest number. Like, we're not thriving because we have lost this trust that they really are here to protect and serve, right? So hopefully that illustrates kind of the rule utilitarianism lens on the terrorist and the bomb, that like a rule utilitarianism really wouldn't say like, no, it's okay, because if everyone played it out, citizens would lose faith in law enforcement and social trust would deteriorate.
So my class is at 6:30.
Similarly, with zero tolerance policies, like as many of you know, in a lot of schools in America, they have a pretty strict policy against threats, guns, pictures of guns, down to like kids being expelled, like elementary schoolers, for drawing pictures of guns, even, which clearly are not that dangerous. But after Columbine and I'm blanking on the other like school shootings that were in the early day. They thought that better to have a zero tolerance policy, like come down hard on all of the little examples, rather than let anything slip past, like someone making a death threat list, and like they could just be joking because they're in elementary school or middle school. But in that one case, because I've known kids who have been expelled for making a death threat list in like middle school. And if you go by the situation, it does seem like an overstep to expel a kid for like making a kill list in elementary school. If you like, they're just a kid. But what would rule utilitarianism say? It would say that the morally correct action in any given situation is the one that like produces the overall greatest good and its consequences. It follows a general rule. And so you can see how, as much as like it seems overkill to expel a little kid for like a death threat or something, as a general rule, it might actually produce the greatest consequences, or the greatest morality and its consequences. In the Madison School District, we have a zero tolerance policy generally around the N-word, right? And that, it's caused some heat lately because regardless of context, it's grounds for firing. And, you can see how act utilitarianism or rule utilitarianism would have different consequences on that. I'm being a little long-winded, so I'm going to skip the $20,000 promise case for right now and jump right into some of the prompts. So, as I sort of said, John Stuart Mills was kind of the guy who really made utilitarianism famous, and he was a student of Jeremy Bentham and can kind of be considered a rule utilitarianism, right? Or utilitarianist. What a dumb word, utilitarianism, right? So, does utilitarianism threaten individual rights? What if the sum total of the pain caused by sacrificing the civil rights of the minority is less than the sum total of the pleasure derived as a result by the majority? What's the example that Sandel gives? The Romans used to throw Christians into the Colosseum, and like the lions would eat them. And the Romans had such a blast. The pleasure that they got watching those Christians get eaten, I mean, just worth it, right? So this is kind of the like base level criticism of utilitarianism. John Stuart Mills goes on, very much like the rule utilitarians, to say that like far from being in tension with individual rights, the principle of utility was actually the justification for protecting rights. In other words, Mill believed that protecting individual rights is the best way to increase the sum of happiness in the long run. Was Mill right? Either way, is this really the reason why we should not violate people's basic rights? Is the individual the smallest minority? Good Lord, Eric. Why can't I see this? So, do we think that you can like reduce all pleasures, all goods, down to like pain and pleasure? Like there's a unit of measurement of like pleasure, right? Can they all be weighed on a common scale, or is it possible that the value of some goods, such as love or success or personal achievements and overcoming, cannot coherently be balanced against the value of other goods, like pleasure, eating, Simpsons, etc.? Is this a fatal flaw for utilitarianism? Or do we think, kind of like we've been doing with the little human nature claims I've been throwing in here, that behind our actions and our supposed motivations for these actions, we do actually see like a commonality of interest and motivation? So, food for thought. Okay, just some fun ones. If we were in class, I would spend more time on this just because it's a really fun thing to think about, but doesn't pertain directly, it's just not like crucial enough to work it in. But suppose we have to choose between building a new sports stadium and building a new hospital. Should we build the stadium if there are many more fans, sports fans, than sick people? What about the sick people? Aren't we sacrificing their interests? So utilitarianism, as you saw in the video, is used in all sorts of situations just for cost-benefit analysis, of which, you got to figure out how to apply funding. Do we put money towards a sports stadium, which will bring hundreds of thousands of people certain degrees of pleasure and happiness, right? Or do we build a hospital that can take care of 500 terribly ill people? So it's going to reduce their pain and suffering. It might not cause them a lot of pleasure, but it's going to keep them alive, right? How do we compare the pleasure to the many against the real needs of the few? Can utilitarianism address this, right? Or again, a classic one, like suppose you have to move to Boston or to Las Vegas. If you move to Boston, you'll fall in love and get married. If you move to Vegas, you'll get rich but stay single. Should you move to Vegas if being rich gives you more pleasure? Are all pleasures commensurable? And in the video I attached, there is a section of John Stuart Mill's under it. If you want to write for one of the write-ups on this distinction between higher and lower pleasures, it is one of the most worthwhile things you can sink a good hour into. Mills tries to defend utilitarianism against this charge by arguing that greater weight should be put on higher pleasures. But which pleasures are higher pleasures? Mill proposes that of two pleasures, the pleasure preferred by the majority of people who have experienced both pleasures should be counted as the higher pleasure. Is this a good way to distinguish higher and lower pleasures? Does the majority, even if it's well-informed, always prefer the higher pleasure? So just a brief example of this. Those of you who have had a full bloody schedule where you have to get up before sunrise and maybe pre-sport workout, go to school, go to your job, go home, do homework, right? Get up and you do this for months on end. If you've known that experience, right? That's a certain sort of rigor, right? And then summer hits and you just sit in front of the TV all day for a week or two, right? You just gorge. Anyone know what gorging is? Well, how long does that pleasure last? Well, gorging gets tired by day 2 or 3, right? And the argument is anyone who's both gorged and had a full schedule necessarily gives preference to the full schedule and says that, no, that's a greater, so it's not like an immediate pleasure, I'm just, right? But you guys who have a full work schedule and are doing school and have a family, it's hard, you're grinding, right? Y'all are grinding right now. And if someone asked you, are you having fun? You'd be like, hell no, but I'm grinding, right? But if you've ever lounged and just kicked it, right? That as fun as that is in the moment, it doesn't have the same sort of reward and inner satisfaction that this does. And so that's just one illustration of his point being no, there are higher and lower pleasures. And then we know which ones are higher because people who have experienced them necessarily, if you've been a player and slept around for years and then finally settled down, when those people who settle down tell the players hey, you're missing out, they're speaking from experience. And so John Stuart Mill goes into it a little bit more, but I really urge people to have a go at it.